At the inheritance distribution, my sister claimed it all, but I smiled. Dad, don't you know? That was the moment the room shifted, when every breath tightened, every eye darted toward me, and a hush fell so deep it felt like the walls themselves were listening. They all thought they knew how the day would end. They thought they understood our family, our history, the weight of what was being divided. But they didn't know the nights that shaped us, the shadows that followed us, or the truths that had been buried so carefully they were almost forgotten. Almost. What happened next wasn't about money, or land, or even legacy. It was about a secret older than any of them realized, a secret only I had been waiting for. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon so you never miss a tale that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Smash that like if you love suspense, and drop a comment below telling me what you think is really going to happen, because trust me, nothing is as it seems. Every twist, every secret, every shocking revelation is coming, and you'll want to be here for every single one. Don't blink. Or you might miss the truth. My name is Eleanor Garrison, though most folks in Silver Creek still call me Ellie, like I never grew past the girl running barefoot between the mill tracks and the creek bed. I'm 78 now, and I've learned that a long life doesn't soften the memories, it sharpens them. Especially the ones you tried hardest to forget. That night, the night the lights went out on Mill Street, is carved into me the way initials get scratched into wet cement. You think it'll fade, but even decades later, you can still run your fingers over every groove. I had just turned 11. My birthday cake still sat on the counter, its candle stubs of white wax leaning like tired soldiers. The whole town smelled faintly of iron and coal dust, as it always did, but that night there was something else, something metallic, like the air before lightning strikes. When the power cut out, it wasn't the sudden jolt that scared me. Outages were common in Silver Creek. No, it was the silence afterward. The mill was down for repairs that week, so even that constant rumble we all lived with was absent. It felt like the world had stopped breathing. I remember walking into the kitchen where Dad sat hunched over the table. A single candle glowed next to him. Its flame made his face twitch in a way that didn't look like him, like the shadows were pulling him into a shape he didn't belong in. In front of him were 2 envelopes, one with Victoria's name, written in that careful, squared handwriting Dad used whenever something mattered. The other, with my name, looked torn at the edge, as if someone had tried to open it and changed their mind halfway. When he saw me, he flinched. Not the way a father does when he's startled, but the way a man does when he's been caught doing something that isn't meant to be seen. He slid my envelope into his coat with a motion that was too smooth, too deliberate. And his face softened in a way that felt practiced. Not yet, he whispered. I remember just standing there, barefoot on the cold linoleum, thinking he meant me. That I wasn't ready for whatever secret he kept folded in that envelope. But then his eyes shifted toward the dark hallway, toward the room where Victoria slept. And he murmured again, more to himself than to me, "She isn't ready." That shiver up my spine didn't come from the cold. Later that night, after Mom kissed my forehead and left for her night shift at the hospital, I woke to the creak of a floorboard. The kind of sound that makes you open your eyes before you know why. I slid out of bed and tiptoed to my door, which was open just a crack. Enough for me to hear Dad's voice, low and urgent, like he was arguing with someone he didn't want to be overheard. "But she's mine," he said. "You promised." His voice cracked on the last word. Dad never let his voice crack. Never let anything slip. At first, I thought he was on the phone, but we didn't have a portable one, and the hallway was too dark to hide someone else. There was a pause, a long one, and I swear to you, even now, at 78, I'd bet my own bones that what answered him wasn't real. Or maybe it was too real. The whisper that came back was soft, almost gentle. But it hit me in a place nothing had ever hit before, because it sounded exactly like me, not like a stranger mimicking my voice. No. Like my voice, aged down to the exact pitch of my childhood. As if another version of me stood just outside of sight, Dad stepped closer to the shadowed end of the hall. And the candle he'd brought flickered wildly against the walls. His shoulders were shaking, not with fear, but with the kind of anger a man gets when he realizes he's losing something he always assumed he owned. When he said my name, it trembled. I didn't know whether to run to him or run from him. Something brushed past the crack of my door, cold, like a breeze that shouldn't exist indoors, and I swear I heard my own breath whisper back to him, "A promise is a promise." I pressed my hand to my throat, realizing the whisper hadn't come from my lips. That night changed something in me. Not just in what I believed about my father, but in what I believed about myself. For years, I tried to convince myself that I'd dreamed it, that the dark can twist sounds until they become lies. But deep down, even at 11, I knew what I'd heard. I knew it wasn't a dream. And I knew that whatever was in that envelope had something to do with the voice that wore my own, and that was the first night I wondered, truly wondered, if Victoria and I were both my father's daughters. Or if only one of us was. I remember the summer Samuel appeared like it's replaying on an old projector reel, grainy around the edges, humming faintly, but every frame sharp enough to cut. Silver Creek summers were usually loud, kids yelling by the tracks, cicadas buzzing in the trees, neighbors shouting from porches. But that year, everything felt muted, as if the whole town were leaning in to listen to something it couldn't quite hear. Maybe that's why Samuel slipped in so easily. Quiet things always find their way into quiet spaces. He showed up one sticky afternoon in July, standing at the edge of our yard like he'd been dropped there by mistake. He was thin, tall for his age, with hair too long and eyes too old. Dad was fixing the back fence, and when he saw the boy, he nodded with a familiarity that startled me. Like he'd been expecting him. When I asked who the kid was, Dad barely looked up. "Just a neighbor's boy," he said. "Helping out." But neighbors in Silver Creek talked. They always talked. By nightfall I'd asked around everywhere, Mrs. Collins, the Millers, even old man Devereux, who knew everyone's business whether they wanted him to or not. Nobody had heard of a Rowan family. Nobody had seen Samuel before that day. The way he followed Dad around, silent and obedient, made the hairs on my neck rise. He moved like he was listening to something none of us could hear. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was always strange. Too direct. Too certain. Victoria hated when he looked at her, and I can't blame her. His gaze lingered like he was searching for cracks in her face. One evening, I found him sitting on the back steps, hands folded neatly in his lap, staring at the yard like he could see shapes beneath the dirt. When he noticed me, he smiled, not warmly, but knowingly. "Your father says you'll get everything," he murmured. "But she thinks it belongs to her." His words hit me like cold water. Everything? What everything? We lived in a crooked house with peeling paint and creaking floors. Dad had a veteran's pension and little else. I tried to laugh it off, but he didn't blink. He didn't even breathe in the way children do. He just watched me, as though waiting for me to accept the truth of something I didn't yet understand. When I asked Dad about it later, he slammed his toolbox shut so hard the metal screamed. "Don't listen to that boy," he barked. "He repeats things he shouldn't." That should have been the moment I insisted, demanded answers, but I didn't. Children are taught obedience before they're taught curiosity. I wish I'd been a disobedient child. One night, a storm rolled over Silver Creek, thunder that shook the window frames, rain slicing sideways through the yard. We'd settled in early, the kind of night where you read by candlelight and pretend not to notice the shadows dancing too close to the walls. Samuel was in the living room with us, standing near the door. He didn't sit. He never sat. He just watched the lightning flicker, as if counting something hidden in each flash, and then, without a sound, he was gone. The door never opened. The window stayed shut. But when Dad got up to check the hallway, there were muddy footprints trailing from the threshold toward the back of the house, too large for a child, too deep for someone who'd simply passed through. They stopped abruptly near the basement door, smudged into nothing. Dad stared at them for a long moment before pressing his fingers against his forehead, like something behind his eyes hurt. The next morning, I woke to the smell of burning rubber. From my window I saw Dad in the yard, tossing Samuel's mud-caked boots into a metal barrel. The flames hissed and spit as they devoured the leather. When I ran outside and asked why he was burning the boy's shoes, he didn't look at me. "They were ruined," he said. "No sense keeping what's ruined." But his hands trembled as he lifted the metal poker. A week passed with no sign of Samuel. I thought maybe he'd been a strange dream we'd collectively shared. But dreams don't leave footprints. Then came the pounding on our front door. A woman stood there, soaked with sweat and tears, her hair wild from running. "My son," she screamed. "Where is my son? Where is Samuel?" Her voice cracked on his name, her eyes bloodshot and frantic. If grief had a shape, it would have looked like her. Dad stepped forward, calm as a stone in a river. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I never had a son." The woman wailed, collapsing against the porch rail. Victoria clutched my arm so tightly her nails dug into my skin. And in that moment, as I stared at Dad's perfectly blank expression, I realized something chilling. He didn't say he didn't know the boy. He didn't say the boy wasn't here. He said, "I never had a son." As if that was the real truth we'd all been too afraid to face. I was 16. And 16 is an age where curiosity doesn't just whisper, it howls. It claws. It pulls you toward truths you're not ready for but hunger for anyway. Victoria was the obedient one, always smoothing her hair, always closing doors gently, always pretending not to hear the things that made our house feel too full for just the three of us. But me? I had spent years feeling watched by corners with no eyes, by the memory of a boy who vanished into mud, by a voice that once whispered in my own pitch. Curiosity wasn't dangerous to me. It was survival. Dad kept his basement safe behind the workbench, an old dented steel thing with a dial and a knob worn smooth by his thumb. He always locked it before leaving for work, always checked it twice. He didn't know I'd been practicing with hairpins and old padlocks for months. I learned from TV, from books, from boredom, and from something else, a pulsing sense that the safe held the answers none of us dared ask.
The night I opened it, the house was quiet. Victoria was at a youth group retreat. Dad was supposed to be on night shift. The basement smelled of oil and dust, and the bulb overhead flickered like a heartbeat. I knelt before the safe, slid the bobby pin into the thin gap, twisted once. Twice, and the lock clicked with a soft sigh, like it had been waiting for me. Inside, everything was neat. Dad wasn't neat with most things, but these papers were stacked with surgical precision. The first thing I pulled out was my birth certificate. Simple, plain. But then came another Victoria's and another beneath that. A third one, a third sister we never had. Emily Garrison. Born 1947, died. There was no date. The line for date of death was blank. The breath inside me turned cold. Mom died in 1948. She would have known if she'd had another daughter. So why was Emily erased from our lives like chalk from a board? Why had her birth been stored away like a secret too heavy to bury? I dug deeper and found a slim, yellowed packet bound with a metal clip. The title jumped from the page like a shout. Revised Asset Designation Custodial Transfer, 1951. It looked official, stamped by the county, by the state, by someone I didn't recognize. Beneath Dad's signature, sharp, deliberate, the same I'd seen on school papers, was another signature. A shaky cursive, trembling like the writer's hand had fought against itself. It spelled my mother's name, but Mom had been gone 3 years by then. My hands shook as I held the document. Something about the paper felt wrong. Too cold, too thin, as if whatever truth lived inside it had drained all warmth from the fibers. I ran my thumb over the ink, trying to feel something human, something grounding. All I felt was fear. Why were there 3 birth certificates? Why did one child's name vanish from our lives? What assets were being transferred? What was my father custodial guardian of? And why was a dead woman approving anything? A breeze brushed the back of my neck, though the basement window was closed. I didn't realize then that the house had grown colder. I didn't notice how the shadows near the furnace had deepened, how they seemed to curl toward me like listening shapes. Only when the floorboard at the top of the stairs groaned did my body react. My fingers froze mid-turn of the page. My pulse hammered against my skin. I turned slowly, the paper still in my lap. Dad stood in the doorway. His silhouette was enormous against the stairwell light. Shoulders tense, jaw tight. His eyes weren't angry. They were resigned, worn, like he'd been waiting years for this moment to come clawing out of the dark. "You were never supposed to open that until the end," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room thick as smoke. Something in it cracked not with rage, but with grief. Old grief. Grief he'd never let breathe. I swallowed, my throat dry. "What end?" I whispered. Dad stepped down one slow foot after the other, the steps creaking beneath his weight. The shadows seemed to lean toward him as he descended. Behind him, the basement door swung shut without anyone touching it. He didn't flinch. I clutched the papers to my chest, my hands trembling. I thought he'd take them from me, snatch them away, lock everything up again. Instead, he lowered himself onto the bottom step and stared at me the way a man stares at a truth he knows will shatter everything if spoken aloud. "That wasn't meant for you yet," he said softly. "Not until you were old enough to understand why Emily had to disappear, and why you didn't." A chill sliced through the room. I didn't understand then. Not fully, but in the stillness between us, something old and unspoken came awake, something that had been waiting for 16 years, by the time I left for college. Victoria had transformed into a creature of whispers and half-shadows. She wasn't the golden child anymore, the bright, favored girl who twirled her hair and laughed at every one of Dad's dry jokes. No, something had cracked inside her, subtle at first, then spreading like a hairline fracture in glass. By the summer after my freshman year, she was barely recognizable. Her movements sharper, her voice quieter, her eyes constantly flitting to corners as though expecting something or someone to step out of them. I came home that June expecting the usual. Dad tinkering in the garage, Victoria arguing with him about curfews or boys or college majors. Instead, the house felt too still, heavy, as if the walls had grown thick with things unsaid. Dad wouldn't look at me for more than a second. Victoria wouldn't look away, and everywhere I turned, the shadows seemed longer than they should have been for that time of year. She had a routine now. Every Thursday evening, she slipped out dressed as though heading to some church social, but she never actually went to church. I followed her once, just once. I watched her meet Sheriff Blake Horner in the old courthouse parking lot. The sheriff should have been retiring that year, but he looked older than retirement. Tired in a way that settled deep into his bones. They didn't speak at first. He simply handed her a manila folder and she nodded as though confirming instructions. Another time, I saw her speaking with Daniel Rusk, our family lawyer. He always looked uneasy around our family, too many forced smiles, too many documents he claimed to have misplaced. Victoria cornered him behind the post office, gripping his arm so tightly he winced. She wasn't asking him for anything. She was telling him Pastor Meredith Cole, the one who had baptized us both as babies, came next. She and Victoria held hushed conversations in the church's back garden. Whenever I approached, they stopped immediately, plastering on smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Victoria would change the subject, her voice too sweet, too fixed, like she was speaking lines from a script. But the strangest of all was the woman I'd never seen before, Dr. Leona Horwich. Tall, silver-haired, eyes sharp enough to cut. She visited our house late at night, always parked a block away, always staying only long enough to hand Victoria a stack of papers. Medical-looking forms, charts, warnings. The four of them, sheriff, lawyer, pastor, doctor, made an odd circle, and Victoria was at its center. Everything they said stopped the moment my shadow touched the room. Everything they planned halted when I breathed too close. One night, I heard Victoria through the cracked door of Dad's office. Her voice was a hiss-coiled, venomous. "No, I don't care what Ellie's paperwork says. I'm the one who was promised the inheritance." My chest tightened. I didn't understand what paperwork she meant. The documents in Dad's safe. Emily's birth certificate. The custodial transfer forms Mom had somehow signed after her own death. Before college, inheritance had meant furniture, Dad's old tools, maybe the house if it didn't fall over first. But the way she said the word, it sounded like a burden, a prophecy, a debt, something that bound us. I stormed straight to Dad in the living room. He didn't even look up from the newspaper. What did she mean about inheritance? About what was promised? His eyes didn't flicker. He didn't blink. He just folded the paper slowly and said in a voice both too soft and too stern, "The things we pass down aren't always money." I felt the floor tilt beneath me, because the way he said it wasn't comforting, it was warning that night. I lay awake, replaying every strange thing I'd seen over the years. Samuel's sudden appearance and disappearance, the muddy footprints that stopped Emily's missing death date, the signature of a dead mother, Victoria's new alliances with people who should have protected us, not hidden things behind my back. Sometime after midnight, I heard a scraping sound, soft like furniture being dragged. Then silence. In the morning, the house smelled faintly of dust-disrupted dust. When I passed by Victoria's room, something felt wrong. I pushed the door open. The room was empty, not messy, not rearranged, empty. The bed frame, gone. The dresser gone. Closets bare. Carpet flattened where heavy furniture had stood. The window opened just a crack, letting in a breeze that stirred nothing, because there was nothing left to stir. My breath caught, panic tightening around my ribs. I bolted downstairs, heart pounding, expecting to find Dad frantic, Victoria missing, the sheriff knocking on our door instead. I found Victoria at the kitchen table, calmly eating toast and eggs, humming lightly, her hair brushed into a perfect golden curtain. She didn't look up right away. When she did, her smile was bright to bright. "Sleep well?" she asked, as though nothing had changed. As though her room wasn't hollowed out, like a body with its bones removed. She took another bite, unfazed, unbothered, unshaken. And that was the moment I realized something terrifying. Either she didn't notice what was missing, or she had decided the thing that vanished wasn't her furniture, it was her eye. Turned 40 with more wear in my bones than I ever expected. And by then, Dad had grown smaller, shrinking, the way old men do when life begins collecting debts they never believed they owed. His hands shook sometimes. His voice wavered. But he still carried that same heavy silence, the kind that filled entire rooms and smothered anything that tried to breathe in its space. So when he invited us to Daniel Rusk's office that gray October morning, I assumed it was routine estate planning. Boring, sad, inevitable. Victoria arrived in a crisp cream coat, her hair pinned back, her perfume thick and sugary. She hugged Dad as though comforting him, but her eyes kept sliding toward me with a softness too deliberate, too practiced, like she was rehearsing being the benevolent victor. Rusk's office smelled of dust, old leather, and the lingering sweat of worry from decades of anxious clients. But the moment he pulled out the will, the air shifted. Even the overhead lights seemed to dim, as though the room braced itself. "This is the most recent version," Daniel said. Sliding the document across the mahogany desk, my stomach nodded. The date at the top read, April 12, 1986. Date I knew with perfect clarity. Because that was the week Dad had been in the ICU, trapped in a haze of painkillers, wires, oxygen tubes drifting in and out of consciousness. He hadn't even known what year it was, let alone been capable of signing legal paperwork. Yet his signature sprawled across the bottom, steady, unmistakably his dot, and beside his, in careful print, Victoria Garrison, sole beneficiary. I stared, blinked, waited for someone to laugh. To joke? To reveal this as some clerical mistake? But Daniel's face was grave, and Dad gazed down at his hands as though afraid of what they might say if they opened. I heard my own voice cut through the room, brittle as glass. This isn't possible. Dad wasn't conscious. He couldn't have signed this before Daniel could answer. Victoria leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with practiced grace. She tilted her head, feigning pity. "Oh, Ellie, you always forget things," she murmured sweetly. "Daddy signed it in front of me. And you?" I felt the words like a cold slap. "Me," I whispered. "Of course," she chirped, tapping the paper. "Your signature is right there." My eyes dropped to the bottom corner, and there it was. My name, dot, in my handwriting. My loops, my slant, my flourish. Only I had no memory of ever lifting a pen. A buzzing sound filled my ears, part panic, part something older, something deeper, something that had been coiled inside me since childhood. I looked up and Daniel was already leaning forward, his breath sharp with anxiety. "You've signed more than you know," he whispered. My pulse stuttered. "What does that mean?" But he didn't answer. He only sat back, folding his hands tightly, like a man trying not to shake. I turned to Dad, expecting anger, confusion, denial, anything. But he wouldn't look at me. Instead, he stared at Victoria with a hollow, resigned sort of sorrow, the kind a man carries when he realizes the future he tried to prevent has already begun. The meeting ended with polite smiles and stiff handshakes. But something poisonous had seeped into the space between us. I left the office in a daze, the will burning behind my eyes, my own signature haunting me like a ghost wearing my skin that night. I drove home slowly, afraid of what waited behind my door. Afraid of what didn't? The house was silent when I entered. Too silent. The air felt stale. As though time had paused the moment I left that morning, I found it on the floor of my bedroom folded once. No envelope. Slipped beneath the door like a secret impatient to be heard. A single scrap of paper. 3 words scrawled in frantic handwriting. "She's not your sister." My breath froze. Outside, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Someone was still in the house. Dad's decline wasn't gradual. It was a collapse sudden, heavy, like the house itself buckled under the weight of whatever had been circling our family for decades. At 82, he had become a fragile outline of the man who once towered over the dinner table, commanding silence with just a look. Now, his breaths rattled like loose bolts in an old machine, and the shadows that gathered around his room felt almost alive, like they'd been waiting for his body to weaken before closing in. People started showing up at strange hours, whispering. Through the hallways, slipping in and out like mourners at a funeral that hadn't happened yet. Benjamin Crow, the funeral director, thin as a wire, skin pale as wax, visited twice a week, though Dad wasn't dead. He'd sit across from the bed, fold his hands, tilt his head, and speak low, like preparing Dad for something more binding than burial. Then there was Marion Lively, Dad's secretary from decades ago. She arrived with stacks of papers she refused to let me touch. "Just records," she'd mutter as she hurried past. But her eyes skittered over me like she feared I might recognize something in her expression. Her visits always ended with her wiping tears she claimed were from dust. Retired Judge Calvin Drury came next. He'd sit on the porch steps with Dad's old briefcase and stare at the horizon like it had wronged him. The judge had always been a stern figure in town, but now he looked hollowed out, as if the knowledge he carried had been eating him from the inside for years. But the one who stayed the longest, who circled the house like a dog guarding a secret, was Sheriff Blake Horner. He would stand in the doorway with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his gaze fixed on me longer than on Dad, as though I were the fragile patient, not the dying man in the next room. Every time I walked by, his eyes narrowed, calculating, cautious, wary. It felt like all of them, director, secretary, judge, sheriff, had been summoned. Not by Dad, but by whatever truth he had shielded me from since childhood. One night, long after the others had gone and the house settled into its uneasy quiet, I heard Dad calling my name. His voice scraped the air, thin but urgent. I rushed to his bedside, the lamp casting weak light across his gaunt face. His eyes were glossy, unfocused at first, then sharp with a clarity that frightened me. "Ellie," he rasped, lifting a trembling hand. "They promised your mother." My heartbeat turned jagged. Promised her what? His fingers curled weakly around my wrist, hot with fever. "You were always meant to take my place." I froze. "Your place? Where, Dad? In what?" He swallowed hard, each breath shallower than the last. "Victoria? She was only ever the placeholder." The word throbbed in the air. Placeholder, as if my sister's entire life had been designed to stand between me and something I'd never been told existed. "For what?" I whispered. "What?" "Inheritance. What did you pass down?" His lids flickered, his mouth trembled, and for a moment I thought he would finally speak the truth. I had chased since the basement safe, since the footprints, since the night Samuel spoke with my father, in a voice that echoed mine. The inheritance, he exhaled. each syllable a struggle. It's not what she thinks. What is it then? I leaned close, desperate. Please, Dad, tell me. His chest rose once, more barely. His eyes watered not from fear, but from regret. Regret sharp enough to cut through the dimness, choking the room. Then his breath shuddered. His lips moved, but no sound came. His head slumped to the side. I waited, held his hand, counted the seconds between breaths that no longer came. Dad died. Before finishing the sentence that could have broken everything open, the lamp flickered once, twice. The shadows in the hallway shifted as if something had just slipped away. When I finally looked down, his hand was still gripping something. His fingers were curled tightly around a small brass key, worn at the edges, warm from his fading heat. I pried it loose, expecting to see my initials etched into the metally G, the way he marked all things meant for me. But engraved on the head of the key were 2 letters, VG, Victoria Garrison, my sister's key.or. The woman I'd been told was my sister. My stomach twisted. A sickening realization crept over me like frost climbing a window pane. Dad hadn't died trying to tell me what the inheritance was. He died trying to warn me who it really belonged to, and why that should terrify me. The conference room smelled of old varnish and cold ambition. The kind that settles deep into the carpet fibers and into the bones of anyone foolish enough to sit there. They had gathered early, of course they had. Victoria was already in place when I walked in, sitting straight-backed at the head of the table like she'd rehearsed the posture for weeks. Her allies flanked her like a wall of rotting oak. Sheriff Horner with his faded authority, Judge Drury with his nicotine-stained fingers, Pastor Meredith with her forced serenity, and Dr. Harwich, whose gaze flicked toward me with clinical hunger, as though she were examining a specimen she'd long been waiting to dissect. They didn't offer me a chair, but I pulled one out anyway. Let the legs scrape. Let them hear it. Daniel. Rusk stood near the projector, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered the documents. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, older, but not wiser. More beaten down by the years of secrets he'd been forced to guard. He cleared his throat, voice thin. This is the final will, but Victoria cut him off. She rose so quickly her chair screeched backward. There's no need to read anything, she declared. Her smile was triumphant, brittle around the edges, a smile she had built her whole life toward. All of my father's assets, properties, accounts, and designations belong to me. He chose me as his successor. Ellie can leave now. She tossed her hair over her shoulder like a queen dismissing a servant, and the others nodded silent, firm, complicit. They'd built this narrative together, brick by brick, lie by lie. They thought they stood in a fortress. Daniel hesitated, flipping the folder open. His eyes scanned the first page and widened. Victoria? These documents aren't— Oh, stop, she snapped. I told you, Daddy updated the will. I have the signatures. She yanked a thick stack of envelopes from her purse and slammed them onto the table so violently dust rose in a faint cloud. These prove everything, every modification, every beneficiary change, every appointment. Sheriff Horner shifted, resting his hand near his holster, not because he needed to, but because he wanted me to see it. A warning. Pastor Meredith clasped her hands, lips moving silently as if praying for me to disappear. Judge Drury kept tapping the table, a nervous metronome for their collective lie. I let them breathe in their certainty. Their arrogance tasted thick in the air. Then I did something that broke the rhythm of the entire room. I smiled, a slow, steady smile that made Victoria's confidence falter. She blinked once, twice, her hand tightened around the stack of envelopes. What are you smiling at? She snapped. I leaned back slightly, folding my hands in my lap, my heartbeat steady, because I said softly, I know something no one else in this room understands. She scoffed. Oh, Ellie, spare us. You've always been so dramatic. But I wasn't looking at her anymore. I lifted my gaze past her shoulder toward the upper corner of the room, toward the small black dome embedded there. The security camera, its red light glowed like an omen dot, and then I said the sentence that turned every bone in that room to ice. Dad, don't you know? Victoria froze, Daniel froze, even Sheriff Horner's facade cracked. Because the words weren't meant for them. The camera blinked a soft whir filled the silence, and then the screen behind Daniel flickered on. Static first. Then a low hum, then an image sharpened into view. A hospital room bathed in soft fluorescent light. A frail man propped up in bed, oxygen tubes curling like vines around his face. My father, weeks before his death, awake, coherent, speaking into the lens with a lucidity none of them believed he still possessed. The room behind me erupted into gasps, curses, shuffling chairs. But I didn't turn. I kept my eyes on the screen, on Dad's tired face as he drew in the breath that would undo every lie, every forged document, every manipulated signature, Victoria whispered. No, no. Nitrogen monoxide, her voice rising into raw panic. The others leaned forward, exposed, desperate. Dad lifted his eyes in the recording, and before he spoke, he did something strange. He looked directly into the camera, directly at me. Like he knew I'd be sitting in that room one day, like he had been waiting for this moment, this exact moment long before any of us realized we were moving toward it. The screen crackled. Dad opened his mouth, and the truth, they'd tried so hard. Two berry began to rise. The room fell silent in a way I'd never heard before. No shuffling, no breathing, just a collective stunned paralysis as my father's face filled the screen. The same face I'd kissed goodbye. The same face I had watched sink into stillness. But here, in that recording, he was alive enough to burn the air out of the room. His eyes were clear, not clouded, not confused. Clear, sharp, terrifyingly aware. "If you're watching this, Ellie," he began, voice thin but steady. "Then they've already tried to take what's yours." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I heard Victoria's breath catch sharp, panicked, unprepared. Sheriff Horner reached instinctively for the table's edge. Dr. Horwich stiffened. Judge Drury let out a small, involuntary groan. "The kind that slips from a man who knows his lies have finally come home to roost," my father continued, staring directly into me through the camera. "Through the years of confusion and manipulation, Victoria isn't my biological daughter." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Victoria's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her hands trembled at her sides. The perfect nails she always kept filed and polished dug into her own palms, leaving crescents of white in her skin. Dad didn't pause. She was placed with me by Judge Drury and Dr. Horwich, not out of kindness, but out of debt. The camera angle shifted slightly as he adjusted himself. Her mother owed them. Her father owed them more. They needed a home for her, a name, a place to be raised quietly, out of sight. His jaw tightened. She was never meant to inherit a cent. She was only meant to be kept close. The sheriff's eyes shuddered closed. Pastor Meredith crossed herself with shaking fingers, as though praying for a miracle that wouldn't come. But Dad wasn't done. The true heir, the true successor. He sucked in a rattled breath. "Is you." There was no mistaking it. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. Gasps filled the room, rippling outward like shockwaves. I didn't look at anyone yet. I kept my eyes locked on my father. "And the inheritance isn't money," he said, leaning closer to the camera. "It's the company, the patents, the land, and the vault." The vault? That word hit Victoria like a knife. She staggered backward into the sheriff's chair. Gripping it for balance, Dad's voice dropped to a near whisper. But it echoed like a scream. "Only Eleanor has the clearance." The video flickered, pixelated, then froze on his face filled with solemn finality. And then the screen went black. The room exhaled all at once. A guttural sound of panic and disbelief. I finally turned to my sister. Her skin had gone nearly translucent. Her eyes shook as though trying to find a crack in reality where my father's words hadn't happened. And then she whispered, broken, trembling, "He promised it to me." I leaned toward her, feeling no triumph, only the cold, clean clarity of truth. "No," I breathed. "They promised you a lie so you'd keep me distracted." Her lips quivered. "But," they said, "I was chosen. You were placed," I said softly. "Not chosen." Dr. Horwich stood abruptly, but before she could take a step, Judge Drury grabbed her sleeve with surprising strength and hissed, "Sit down. We've lost." Sheriff Horner didn't dare move. His authority evaporated. Pastor Meredith whispered a prayer under her breath, but even she couldn't look at Victoria. Daniel Rusk walked around the table, his face pale but resolute, holding a stack of documents, real documents this time. He placed them in front of me with hands that no longer trembled. "These," he said quietly, "are the originals. Signed by your father when he was fully lucid, locked in his private case, untouched." Victoria lunged forward, but Horner caught her wrist, not out of loyalty, but fear. Fear of what she might do. Fear of how far she'd been willing to go. Fear that maybe he had never controlled her at all, but had simply helped feed a monster raised on promised power. Slowly, deliberately, I opened the folder. My name, my inheritance, my clearance, my father's true will. Every lie unraveled in seconds. Victoria collapsed into her chair, eyes hollowing into something unrecognizable. "This isn't real," she whispered. "It can't be real. I did everything they told me. Everything." Her gaze darted between them, Drury, Meredith, Horwich, but they wouldn't even look at her. I closed the folder and stood, feeling the weight of decades shift into place. My father's truth, the truth they had buried, rewritten, manipulated, it was all mine now. The company, the land, the patents, the vault, and the legacy. They had tried so desperately to hide from me. Victoria's voice cracked like thin ice. "Ellie, please." But the time for lies had died with the tape. And with Dad, I stared at her for a long, still moment. Then I walked out, the originals in my hand, the door closing behind me, with the finality of a life reclaimed.